There is a prayer scratched into the walls of an underground burial tunnel beneath the city of Rome. It was not written by a theologian. It was not composed for a liturgy book. It was written by an ordinary Christian, sometime in the 2nd century, for someone they had just buried. And the prayer does not say goodbye. It asks God to receive them, to remember them, to grant them peace. That prayer is still there. You can visit it. And it is older than most of the arguments against it. This is not a medieval invention. This is not a tradition that evolved out of superstition or church politics. Prayer for the dead is one of the oldest continuous practices in the history of the people of God. It predates Christianity. It runs through the Old Testament, threads itself into the New, and shows up in the writings of believers who knew the apostles personally. So the question is not whether the early church prayed for the dead. The record is too clear for that. The question is what they understood when they did it, and what Scripture actually gives us to stand on. Let's start where the story starts. Most people who challenge prayer for the dead will tell you it isn't in the Bible, and they will skip over one of the most direct passages in all of Scripture to make that claim. 2 Maccabees, chapter 12. Judas Maccabeus, the Jewish military leader, has just led his soldiers through a battle. Some of his men have died. And when their bodies are recovered, something is discovered beneath their tunics. Pagan amulets. Objects they should not have had. Objects that represented a turning away from the God of Israel. Now here is what Judas does next. He doesn't condemn them. He doesn't declare them beyond reach. He takes up a collection among his surviving soldiers, sends it to Jerusalem, and has a sin offering made on behalf of the dead. The text says this explicitly in verse 46. He made atonement for the dead, so that they might be delivered from their sin. This is a Jewish general, acting within the Jewish faith, in the 2nd century before Christ, performing an intercessory act on behalf of people who have already died. And the author of Maccabees does not present this as something strange or controversial. He presents it as a noble thing, a thing that reflects the belief in resurrection, because that is the logic underneath it. You only pray for someone if you believe there is still something prayer can reach. Now, Protestants will note that Maccabees is not in their canon. That is a real theological difference worth acknowledging. But here is what cannot be dismissed so easily. This passage tells us what Jewish believers in the centuries immediately before Jesus understood about the relationship between the living and the dead. And Jesus himself was shaped by that world. Move into the New Testament, and the evidence does not disappear. It gets quieter, but it is there. 2 Timothy, chapter 1, verses 16 through 18. Paul is writing from prison. He is near the end of his life. And he mentions a man named Onesiphorus, who had searched for Paul in Rome and found him and was not ashamed of his chains. Paul writes, "May the Lord grant mercy to the household of Onesiphorus." And then, 2 verses later, he writes something distinct. May the Lord grant him to find mercy from the Lord on that day. Biblical scholars have noted for centuries what is unusual about this passage. When Paul speaks of the household of Onesiphorus, he addresses them in the present tense. When he speaks of Onesiphorus himself, he shifts. On that day, meaning the day of judgment. The man is spoken of differently than his living family. The most natural reading, the one that several early commentators landed on, is that Onesiphorus had already died by the time Paul wrote these words, and Paul is praying for him anyway. This is the Apostle Paul, the man who wrote Romans and Galatians and Corinthians, the man whose theology of grace is the most carefully constructed argument in the New Testament. And he is offering what looks remarkably like a prayer for a man who is no longer living. The New Testament word that shapes everything underneath this conversation is nekros, the dead. and the word that sits alongside it in early Christian thought is koinonia, communion, fellowship, participation. The early church did not understand death the way the modern Western world does. Death in the Greek-speaking Christian world was not a wall. It was a threshold. The community of believers did not end at the grave. It passed through it. This is why Paul can write in Romans 8:38 that neither death nor life can separate us from the love of God. He means it structurally. The bond that holds the church together is not biological. It is not proximity. It is the love of God Himself. And that love does not stop at the cemetery gate. When a believer prays for a deceased brother or sister, they are not reaching outside the church. They are reaching across a threshold to someone still held within the same love that holds them. You do not have to guess what the earliest Christians believed. They wrote it down. Tertullian, writing around A. AD 211, describes the practice of praying for the dead as something Christians did routinely on the anniversaries of those who had died. He is not introducing it. He is describing it as an established custom. The martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicity, one of the earliest Christian documents outside the New Testament, records a vision in which the martyr Perpetua sees her deceased brother Dinocrates suffering and prays for him. She prays repeatedly, and in a subsequent vision, she sees him relieved. The document treats this not as something exotic, but as something her fellow Christians would immediately understand. The catacomb inscriptions, those prayers scratched into stone beneath Rome, follow a consistent pattern across hundreds of individual graves. Refrigerium sit tibi. May there be refreshment for you. In pace, in peace. Deus refrigeret spiritum tuum. May God refresh your spirit. These are not farewell messages. They are petitions. They are addressed to God on behalf of the dead. And they were written by people who in some cases had personally known the generation that walked with the apostles. Here is the thing about this practice that the historical argument alone cannot fully carry. Most people who have ever lost someone they loved have felt the impulse. You stand at a grave, or you lie awake in the dark, and something in you reaches, not backward into memory, forward, upward. You find yourself speaking, or wanting to speak, not just about them, but for them. The early church did not invent that impulse. They simply refused to suppress it. What they understood from their Jewish roots, from the writings of Paul, from the logic of resurrection itself, is that love does not become irrational at the moment of death. The same God who hears your prayers on a Tuesday afternoon hears them when they are offered on behalf of someone who has crossed the threshold before you. Prayer for the dead is not a claim that we can save anyone. Salvation belongs to God. It is not a denial of grace. It is an extension of it. The same posture of trust and intercession that Paul models throughout his letters applied to the whole church, living and dead alike. The practice is ancient. The warrant is scriptural. And the instinct underneath it is one of the most human things there is. You love someone. You pray. The early church simply never stopped.